Hello, my name is Yulia Mendel. I'm a Ukrainian journalist, and we're here in the Kyiv Post studio together with Andrew Kramer, a reporter with the New York Times, who's been covering this region for over 15 years. Andrew, thank you for being with us.
Yulia, it's a real pleasure. Thank you.
So tell us, how long have you been in Ukraine during this war, and where did you travel?
Well, I started covering the tensions around Ukraine in November, and I traveled out to Hranitna in eastern Ukraine, and I wrote about a certain incident of escalation in that village. So we were paying attention to this conflict back in October and November, and then obviously more intensively in December. I came to Kyiv in January, and I've been in Ukraine since then.
So what's your experience of war actually here on the ground? How did you live through this month of war?
Well, this was a very intense month of reporting, and also personally very stressful. We didn't get much sleep, obviously. I covered the battle for Kyiv in the suburbs, and while we were working on this story, we really had two ideas. That on the one hand, we were covering and paying attention to the victims of war, which was very important to document. And this became more important, obviously, after the discovery of human rights abuses in Bucha and in the Kiev region. But there was another side to this conflict as well, which was showing resilience and showing people who had risen to the occasion, risen to this challenge, and were really doing things that maybe they didn't even expect of themselves would be possible. So we wanted to show both sides of this, both document the victims and the cost of the war, and also show this extraordinary outpouring of support for the Ukrainian government in the struggle, for the Ukrainian state, and really inspiring stories and really hopeful stories, as well as the sad stories.
Can I ask you, what's your understanding? What is the reason for this horrible and brutal, cynical war of Russia against Ukraine?
Well, that's a difficult question. Maybe it's even a deeper question of where evil comes from in people, because what we saw in Bucha was an absolutely horrendous scene of bodies, and it's difficult to comprehend how something like that might happen. Maybe in Russia, there's been a sense of grievance that's been cultivated by the leadership, a sense of having been mistreated by the West, and that this was obviously some darkness in Russia that had built up for a long time and hadn't been noticed, and the curtain had not been pulled back on it, despite many warning signs, the poisoning of an opposition leader, going back the war in Chechnya. But this conflict in Ukraine really pulled back the curtain on this issue with Russia.
So what did you learn about the Ukrainian people from this war?
Well, one thing I learned, and I think really the rest of the world learned as well, is just a tremendous amount of spirit that we saw. And right now, everybody wants to be a Ukrainian. Everybody wishes they were Ukrainian. They're so inspired by what has happened here. I just wanted to tell a few personal stories. On maybe the third day of the war, we went to a recruiting center for the Territorial Defense Forces, and there was a large crowd of people signing up, professors, IT workers, people who worked in nightlife in Kyiv. And I met a man who was a computer programmer. He was 38 years old, not very physically fit, obviously had nothing to do with the military earlier in his life, said he had never served, never used a gun before. And we could hear artillery in the background, explosions, because this was the second day of the war, and there was already fighting on the outskirts of Kyiv, and nobody knew at this point how quick this war might last. The Russians could have been in the town. The feeling was they could be on that street in a few days. And he was so frightened that his lips were trembling, and he could hardly speak above a whisper. He had no idea what he was getting into, but he was nonetheless standing in line to pick up his weapon and join these groups of civilians to join the territorial defense. And when you think about courage, it's not just somebody who's naturally brave, perhaps, or is a military man, but somebody who's not from this world, but rose to the occasion and decided it was something he had to do, even though by his own admission he thought he might even be totally useless, but he wanted to do it anyways. Another a really inspiring story that we saw on a similar topic, our photographer met a teacher, she was about 30, a woman who had come to join the Territorial Defense Forces and was also absolutely terrified. Our photographer videoed and interviewed her in a car where she'd just been given a Kalashnikov rifle, and she was crying and really scared. And the photographer asked her, Yulia, her name was Yulia, do you know how to use the gun you're holding? And she said, no, I don't know anything about this gun. I don't know how to use it at all. But she was nonetheless carrying it and joining the Territorial Defense Forces. So we returned to this character, this woman, maybe 3 weeks later, and she was already in military uniform and was feeling much better. She was no longer in that state. She was able to load the bullets in the magazine and was now working at a checkpoint in Kiev. So she really rose to that occasion. And then there was a final element to this, which is not all military. You see stories of people here who've really shown the better side of humanity. There was a woman who was pregnant and in a maternity home, and she had the risk of a premature birth. And so she realized that her struggle in this war would have to be to remain calm for the sake of her health and her baby. And that became her personal battle, was actually not looking at any news about the war, trying to ignore any sound she heard outside the window.
Sounds very difficult to do.
Yeah, she said it was hard, that anytime she picked up her phone, there would be messages. And so she just really struggled with this. But when I met her, she was like very calm and very happy and didn't want to hear about anything outside the maternity ward. And actually in this personal struggle of her, she also achieved success because she had a baby, and she named the girl the middle name Victoria, because it was her own personal victory for herself that she had managed to deal with this very complicated situation on a personal level. So those were some of the examples I thought of what were inspiring stories from what I've seen in Kiev over the past month.
I know that there is no the sign of being fortune teller in your resume, but given the fact that you know very well the mindset of Russian people, mindset of Ukrainian people, and you've been on both sides, how would you predict different scenarios of development of this war? Or when do you think it can finish?
It depends on whether the stated goals, the articulated goals of the Russian leadership, which are really a denial of Ukrainian identity. We saw this in an article that Putin wrote over the summer and in other commentary from state media. So there's this very sweeping, very dark goal of destroying Ukrainian identity, creating a greater Russia in this area. Smaller, more tactical goals such as achieving support for the declared boundaries of the Donetsk and Luhansk self-declared people's republics on the administrative borders of those regions.
And Kherson.
And maybe Kherson and a corridor in the south. And if these smaller goals are the stated goals, that would seem to be a less dangerous situation, a less ideologically driven situation. It's also far from clear that Russia could militarily achieve even the limited goals, given the poor performance of their military in the past month and few weeks. So it's a difficult situation to predict.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts, insights, and your experience being here in Ukraine during this terrible war.
Thank you so much.
So I was talking to Andrew Kramer, a reporter with the New York Times, who's been covering Ukraine and the region for over 15 years. Thank you for being with us.